From having a spotless record in the beginning and losing it all with 2 positive PED tests, to losing even more badly to Robbie Lawler in his UFC comeback fight. Here's how Nick Diaz accused the UFC of setting him up to lose in his UFC return. First of all, he said that he was backed into training. Diaz isn't the type to hide his true feelings. Anyone can tell you that. That's why his recent comments about his fight against Lawler aren't too surprising to hear. But he did say that the UFC sabotaged him. I know that's a big thing to say. So let's unpack that, shall we? The former UFC title challenger made an appearance on the Dying to See Me podcast recently, and he told the host that he entered the cage knowing he wasn't gonna win in that 2021 comeback fight. Why? Well, he started off by saying that outside issues were to blame, which he then explained were about his training. Diaz said he felt like they backed him into training and it was tough for him because he had switched up teams and was finding it hard to get into the momentum. Happens to the best of us. It was actually a really bad time because he revealed he was in between management too. So really nothing was organized. He had to constantly go back and forth between his trainers too, which can get pretty confusing for anyone. Not to mention the fact that some old people were part of his training process. That wasn't all though. The fighter was actually at a bigger disadvantage than most. So wait till you hear what his coach had to say. Cesar Gracie said Diaz had to fight with 2 ruptured discs in his neck. If the management situation wasn't enough, this had to happen as well. We all remember how UFC 266 went down and how the fighter lost. The humiliation is kinda hard to forget, paired with the amount of blood that was on his entire body. That being said, Diaz's claims that the UFC set him up to lose can be backed up by his coach Gracie, who told Submission Radio that El Diablo actually went into that fight with his neck very messed up. He had an operation just 7 weeks before the fight, and that's why his hands were numb. Of course, this stopped him from making 170 pounds, and Gracie said that he simply just didn't have the strength. It wasn't the old Diaz we all know and love, but someone who was under very difficult circumstances. Nate himself said that he wasn't feeling his best, and felt like he was forced to get that first fight out, which obviously led him to lose it pretty brutally. The guy has had a really hostile history with the UFC as a whole. This next one just proves how salty he still is. Diaz said that he has been f***ed over his entire career. El Diablo, in true Diablo fashion, took to Instagram and made a whole reel talking about how unhappy he was with the UFC. Again, this seems exactly like something he would do. Anyway, the reason for making the video was actually because it was the anniversary of his win over Evangelista Cyborg Santos, a moment that's very celebrated online by many UFC social media accounts. This rubbed the fighter the wrong way. So he wrote that these are lucky, and that if he hadn't been screwed over by the UFC all his life, he would have had 2 UFC belts by now, if not 1. Now, keep in mind, this was a Strikeforce fight, where he was doing insanely well before Dana White bought them. Come on, the man had an undefeated run, and won their welterweight championship 3 times. It's suspicious to know that his performances went down when the UFC acquired Strikeforce, and judging by his Instagram rant, I'm pretty sure he's throwing shade at them directly. It's not just the whole organization. Diaz might just have beef with Dana too. After all, their history is pretty messed up as well. Don't believe me? Well, let me remind you of the time Nick fell from grace. USADA suspended Diaz over his attitude, not cheating. Don't get me wrong, the man did test positive positive for banned substances. But the situation was way more complicated than most people know. Okay, so 3 years after he was put on suspension after his fight with Anderson Silva, Jeff Nowitzki, the president of Athlete Health and Performance, told Joe Rogan that it was Diaz's lifestyle that got him suspended, and that he didn't cheat. Sounds pretty unfair if you ask me. The fighter did fail to report his whereabouts 3 times in a year, which is a sign that you're trying to avoid drug testing. But Nowitzki said that the way he lives his life and the people he trusts got him into that situation. According to the vice president, the fighter trusted many people to do his whereabouts for him, but these people kept going in and out of his life and switching up, which just led to the huge suspension that he faced all those years. Not to mention what Dana said about him way back in 2017. Yep, the UFC president said Diaz will never come back to the UFC. When you look at how Dana told MMA Junkie that there's no way Diaz was gonna come back, it just makes you wonder why he said that, considering many fighters have come back after being suspended. He went on to say that the fighter just didn't have the will to fight in the UFC anymore. While he did recount that statement back in 2018, things just weren't drama-free even then. The thing is, Dana confirmed that year that the organization was close to finalizing his return, and that he'd fight against Jorge Masvidal at 235, to which Nate said clearly that he wasn't ready at all. He even said that it was super rude of the UFC to lowball him like that, because he was training at the time, and expecting him to negotiate a whole entire deal was just not it. Plus, he told ESPN that he wasn't gonna go down like that, and denied all claims that he was supposedly fighting at UFC 235. As for 266, I bet you didn't know this other issue he had, which set him up to fail. Diaz had to pay off his NAC debt. Another huge indicator that Diaz was set up to lose his fight against Lawler is the fact that he had another issue going on, which was the fact that he had to pay off his debt to the NAC. UFC 266 happened in 2021, 6 years after he got busted after his fight with Silva, and his coach Gracie revealed that the organization was still demanding money from him at that time. Even though marijuana is legal now, Diaz still had to pay off his debt, and his coach said that it was an added pressure on him, and that kinda does explain why the fighter just lost all motivation to fight at all. He seemed very disinterested in the bout from the beginning. What's more, he even demanded that they bring up the weight from welterweight to middleweight just days before the event, which didn't happen, of course. According to Nick, it was literally set up for failure, to the point where he didn't go in with the mindset that he was gonna win. And if you know El Diablo, you know how uncharacteristic that is of him. What happened to that cold-blooded drive to win, right? Well, I'd tell the fans not to worry too much, because Diaz has said he's ready to fight again in 2023. That was all about how Nick Diaz accused the UFC of setting him up to lose his return fight.